Last week, we were discussing one of the most dramatic developments in recent church history, the consecration of 4 traditional bishops by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and his subsequent excommunication by John Paul II. With us then was Father William Jenkins, a priest who is pastor of St. Teresa's Church in Parma, Ohio, principal of St. Gertrude's Academy in Cincinnati, Ohio, and who was himself ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre in 1978, but parted ways with him in 1983. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. Today we're going to continue the discussion we had. Last week we ended at the point where Father Jenkins was describing what led to his separation. Father Jenkins, welcome back to What Catholics Believe.
Thank you, Jay.
Father, last week we ran out of time, but you were explaining the liturgical changes in the early 60s, before and during the Second Vatican Council, and the reason why these changes actually led to your separation from Archbishop. Could you mention again what were the nature of the changes of John the 23rd that he introduced?
Yes, Julius. The problem, as I was mentioning, was a lack of consistency. You see, I and the priests with whom I work follow simply the old way. We don't mix in any of the changes. But Archbishop Lefebvre was willing to mix in some of the changes. The examples of this inconsistency would be in the liturgy, his continued use of the Confiteor, the servers praying the Confiteor, before the priest distributes Holy Communion at Mass. John the 23rd actually suppressed that in 1960. But Archbishop Lefebvre, although he claims to use the changes of John the 23rd, still continues to use that Confiteor. It would be very noticeable to the people if he didn't. There's a certain amount of inconsistency. It seems like it's a matter of picking and choosing what of the changes we like and what of the changes we don't like. Another example of inconsistency outside of the liturgy would be precisely the consecrations that took place on June 30th. The Archbishop consecrated 4 men. One of those 4 had just a matter of months before led all of his American seminarians into common worship with the modern religion, the conciliar liberals, and it doesn't make sense to, let's say, part company with the modernist liberals in Rome, and as a solution to that, then consecrate a man who had recently led all of the American seminarians into worship with them just months before.
Well, it seems that there was a great deal of drama which preceded this consecration, which the media didn't cover. Apparently, Archbishop Lefebvre was getting very, very close to reconciling his differences with the Vatican and being welcomed into the bosom of the post-Vatican II Church itself. Is this true?
Yes, for a few months before the consecration, there was a great deal of expectancy, not only on the part of the modern Catholic, the Reformed Catholic religion, but also on the part of Archbishop Lefebvre's followers, that they were going to reach some kind of an accord. And on May 5th, 1988, the Archbishop did sign a tentative theological agreement with the authorities in Rome. That agreement was eventually broken, and the Archbishop went ahead to consecrate 4 bishops, which was the occasion of his so-called excommunication. By the way, I'd like to make it perfectly clear that as far as I'm concerned, that excommunication has no value whatsoever. You cannot excommunicate a man for being a Catholic and for adhering to the true traditional Roman Catholic religion.
Yes, but don't you have to obey the Pope?
You have to obey the Pope in everything that is not sinful. And the entire modernist religion that has come about since Vatican II, which was in the gestation period before Vatican II, but which was actually born at Vatican II, is an evil thing.
So you're saying that if Archbishop Lefebvre would have obeyed John Paul II and not consecrated 4 bishops, that would have been sinful?
I think that eventually he would have had to have done the logical thing and to consecrate bishops for the sake of carrying on the faith. I do believe that if he saw clearly that it was his responsibility to do that, and he didn't do it, then he would have been guilty of sin.
Father, the media refers to Archbishop Lefebvre as a rebel, as disobedient, and I think most contemporary Catholics would look at this and would say, well, look, who's this man to tell the Pope what to do? He's clearly disobedient. He has no right to do this. If you're a Catholic, you believe in the supremacy of Peter. How would you answer these objections and these characterizations?
I would say it's not a matter of Archbishop Lefebvre telling the Pope what to do. It is the whole life of the Church prior to Vatican II telling the Pope that he should hold fast to sacred tradition. That's the very purpose of the papacy, is to guard the Church against these radical deviations and going off on tangents, and especially to guard the Church against conforming itself to the values of the modern day. And this Pope is, in so many ways, abandoning the Church to the modern value system. Now one may say, well, he's against abortion, and he's against birth control, and he's against this, and he's against that. Well, he speaks against these things, but he doesn't do anything against them. He does not censure anybody who favors abortion.
What about Reverend
artificial
Kuhn?
birth control.
Reverend Kuhn, Father Curran.
Believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God.
But wasn't he disciplined for that?
No, not really. He was told that he was no longer a Catholic theologian. He's still a Catholic, and he's still a theologian, but he's not a Catholic theologian. That doesn't make sense.
What about Father Curran?
Father Curran, the same way. He was put out of Catholic U, but he's still a Catholic priest in good standing. Religiously, he can still celebrate the Mass, or, well, what they call the Mass now, for the people. He can still preach to the people. They say he can't teach students in a classroom at Catholic University, but he can still get up in the pulpit during the liturgy and spread lies and errors about the Catholic faith. That doesn't make any sense. It is very telling about the faith of these modernists in Rome that the only man worthy of excommunication at present is Archbishop Lefebvre, and it is simply because he still believes that the Roman Catholic religion, the traditional Roman Catholic religion, is still the one true religion.
Father, the media reports often said that Archbishop Lefebvre caused the first schism in 100 years, and often identified him with the Roman Catholics, who, old Catholics rather, I'm sorry, who broke away from the Church in 1870. Would you comment on this identification? Do you think it's valid?
Quite the opposite is true. If one were to compare the doctrines of the old Catholic schismatics of the 1870s with the modern religion of the 1970s, one would find great similarities. For example, Archbishop Lefebvre still believes absolutely in the infallibility of the Pope. But the modern Church is what questions that. The Pope, for them, is a figurehead to be paraded around these various countries. But they don't listen to him. They don't listen to him at all. Look at the document on AIDS. A word comes over from Cardinal Ratzinger saying, this document is no good. And a number of the bishops say, well, who is he to tell us? And we can do what we want to do. Nothing is done about them. Nothing whatsoever. The Pope is basically a figurehead now in the modern Church. He can come out and say, everyone get back into your religious habits. Priests begin wearing your clerical garb. And he's totally ignored. Nothing is done about it. But that's perfectly okay.
The old Catholics then rejected the papal infallibility as defined by Vatican I.
Yes, and the modern Church does the same thing, because the modern Church has basically made up its own religion and rejected the religion that had been taught by 260-some popes before.
You know, in asking this question, I did some research. It turns out that the old Catholics, their priests could marry. They favored religious pluralism and theological freedom. Their founder was a modernist. The congregation elected their pastors, and they made fasting and confessional optional. How does this strike with Archbishop Lefebvre?
It's completely the opposite of what Archbishop Lefebvre stands for. No, the old Catholic schismatics have nothing in common with Archbishop Lefebvre, nothing. As a matter of fact, just as he will not have anything to do with the old Catholic schismatics, for the same reasons he will have nothing to do with these modernists following upon Vatican II. You know, the old Catholics were theologically in line with the Jansenist heresy of the 1600s, the late 1600s. And the Jansenists believed in a democratic church. And that's exactly what the modernists in Rome believe in.
Father, the we promised our listeners that this program would go much deeper than what was written in the newspapers. And to my way of thinking, one of the most earth-shaking issues is the whole posture and the whole questions Archbishop Lefebvre, and not only Archbishop Lefebvre, and others have been raising about the hierarchy. Not about the hierarchy intrinsically, but the occupants. As I mentioned in an earlier program, Archbishop Lefebvre referred to John Paul II as an antichrist in August of 1987. Shortly before the conference at Assisi in 1986, which was sponsored by John Paul II, he, along with Archbishop Castro de Meyer, wrote John Paul II a letter saying that if that conference goes through, they will not recognize him as Pope, recognizing that he defected from the faith. That never took place. But at any rate, there is a growing movement within the traditional Catholic Church of those who are questioning John Paul II's claim to the papacy. What's your view on this whole issue? You know, there's been numerous bishops, many priests have been raising this issue. Is he, in fact, a pope?
Well, Archbishop Lefebvre has himself seemingly wavered on this. He was saying that the new church was a schismatic church 10 years ago, he was saying this. He has actually put out a brochure showing John Paul II going to hell, being turned away from the gates of heaven and beckoned to hell because of his ecumenism, because he rejects the idea, at least in practice, of Roman Catholicism as the one true religion. He's an ecumenist.
This was this cartoon which he put out shortly before the conference of Assisi, and if I remember, it showed John Paul II approaching a church, and our Lord was figured, his figure was in the doorway.
The gates of heaven.
And he didn't permit him, and he said, this is only for those who believe in one religion, no ecumenists allowed. And then there was a picture of Satan, and he was nudging John Paul II with an elbow, and then he said something to the effect that this is the direction for ecumenists, and he was pointing to hell.
That's right. And in August of 1987, as you pointed out, the Archbishop said that Rome was being ruled by antichrists. And it was shortly after that that he began to enter into negotiations to try to work out some kind of an arrangement. It doesn't make much sense. Even when the Archbishop performed the consecrations, he had the four men to be consecrated bishops say that they were being consecrated by the command of Catholic tradition, ordinarily the mandatum, which has to do with the command that comes from the Holy See to be consecrated a bishop, would say you're being consecrated at the command of the Pope. Archbishop Lefebvre said he was consecrating them in the name of Catholic tradition. But he also had them make their allegiance to John Paul II while he was consecrating them. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. What do I think? I don't see how it is possible myself. Now, I am not the magisterium of the Catholic Church. I cannot lay down dogma, and I cannot decide these questions for the faithful. But if you ask my private opinion, my personal opinion, I will tell you that I don't consider the church that came out of Vatican II to be the Roman Catholic Church. It's got a totally different religion. It has an entirely different faith system, an entirely different moral system, and an entirely different governmental system. And so I don't see how it can be the same church. John Paul II is recognized universally as being the head of that church, which I do not see as the Roman Catholic Church. And the question is, how is it possible that he could be both the head of an anti-Catholic church that came out of Vatican II to replace the Catholic religion, and at the same time the head of the true Roman Catholic Church that historically has ties with the faith before Vatican II? I don't see how it's possible.
Father, this issue is, if it's a legitimate issue, would probably be one of the most earth-shaking developments in the history of the Catholic Church, would it not?
It certainly would, yes.
Has there ever been a time when a pope turned out not to be the pope in church history?
There have been times in the history of the church when there was a great deal of confusion. For example, during the so-called Great Western Schism in the late 1300s and into the 1400s, the church went decades in which the people were not really sure who was the pope. There was a pope elected in Rome, Urban VI, And then he was repudiated by the French cardinals, who proceeded to elect a second pope, if that were possible. And then in order to resolve the situation later on, a number of the bishops got together and elected a pope in Pisa. So you had one claimant in Rome, one claimant in Avignon, and one claimant in Pisa. And the only way to resolve, finally, after decades, to resolve that crisis was to have them all resign, and then to have everyone get together again and re-elect. Now, during this time, there were even great saints confused. Saint Catherine of Siena adhered to the Pope in Rome. Saint Vincent Ferrer adhered to the Pope in Avignon, the man who eventually, historically, was not recognized as the true Pope. But it shows that in confusing times, even great saints can become confused and misled. There is only one infallible authority on earth, and that is the magisterium, the supreme magisterium of the Church. Nowadays, I have people say, Father, you've got to follow the new way. There are very holy people following the new way, so it must be good. And people mention Mother Teresa, who's a syncretist. But I just point to the fact that there were times in church history when great saints were confused, and we can't let that be our guide. Our guide as Catholics has to be the traditional Roman Catholic faith as it was always taught from the beginning.
Father Mike,
that is how we know that the conciliar religion is absolutely wrong.
The next question I'm going to ask you is I'd like to preface it by a remark. Then Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, now Saint Robert Bellarmine, is one of the doctors of the Church, and a number of people have referred to his writings and his theological opinions on precisely, and applied them to precisely the situation we're in today. For instance, I believe Abbé de Nantes of France, Father Francis Fenton of the United States, even Archbishop Lefebvre and Archbishop Castor de Meyer himself. Now, what Saint Robert Bellarmine said, Papa hereticus depositus est. If a pope is a heretic, he is no longer the pope. And many of these people have said that John Paul II has embraced heresy publicly, where he publicly denied the teaching mission of the Church during the Second Vatican Council, where he said it's not the duty of the Church to teach all nations. He publicly says, has a doctrine of universal salvation where everyone is saved without exception, no matter what. And his worship with every possible religious sect in the world would indicate that by these actions he betrays that he does not believe the Catholic religion is a true religion. These are the issues that are brought forward. My question is this: how does the Church, how does the average Catholic know whether or not he has a pope? Has the Church ever definitively said, when such and such a thing happens, he is no longer the Pope? Or is it just a gray area which has never been addressed because it was thought that it was impossible that something like this could happen?
There have been statements made by even by the popes that a pope who departs from the faith cannot be the pope. The expression of St. Robert Bellarmine is very telling. Papa hereticus depositus est. Right? He doesn't say Papa hereticus deponendus est, or Papa hereticus depositus sit, which would mean that if the Pope becomes a heretic, then we'd better depose him. No, the point is, if he is a heretic, then he is by that very fact deposed, that he departs from the faith.
So no one can depose the Pope then?
Right, right. He can only depose himself by departing from the faith. And it's simply a matter of fact then. The point is that it's not up to you to judge it for the whole Church, and me to judge it for the whole Church. It's for the remaining Catholic hierarchy to judge that fact. You and I can have a personal opinion on the matter, but we can't make a judgment for the universal Church. Now, what St. Robert Bellarmine also said was that if a pope should give a command that would be damaging to the Church and contrary to the salvation of souls, it would not only be legal and right to resist his commands, but we should also try to prevent others from carrying out his commands. In other words, we should impede the execution of his commands. Now that is what Archbishop Lefebvre is doing, and I think it is the only Catholic thing to do right now.
What about St. Paul and St. Peter?
St. Paul confronted St. Peter and publicly upbraided him for the terrible example that he was giving. But that's not the same case here. Here we have a case of a man who is basically saying that all religions are good and right, and one can save his soul in any of them as long as the individual is sincere. That is not the teaching of the Roman Catholic Faith.
You know, one of the objections I would raise to the resistance of the pontiff is the following. I know many who are devoted to the post-Vatican II Church when they say, why don't you go to the new Mass? Well, I don't go to the new Mass because I studied it carefully and it departs from Catholic doctrine, theology, here, and so on and so forth. And their response would be, well, then you're disobeying the Pope. He said, yes, I'm disobeying the Pope because he's attacking my soul. And then but then they would say, well, you have to apparently make this decision. Everyone has to become a theologian, and everyone has to decide whether or not they're going to be obedient to the Pope. How is this different from Lutheranism, from Martin Luther?
Well, it's diametrically opposed to Lutheranism. I mean, I have been accused of being like Luther. Now, look at the contradiction here. John Paul II will go into a Lutheran church and worship with the Lutherans, and because I will not go with him, I'm accused of being like Martin Luther. That doesn't make sense at all. If anyone is upholding what Luther stood for, it is John Paul II. John Paul II has called him a great reformer. But Luther was not a great reformer. He was a destroyer. He was a revolutionary. I am holding to what is historically the Roman Catholic faith. That is a matter of history. That is a matter of fact. It's undeniable. He is departing from that. There's no question about that. That is objective fact.
No.
And I am simply following the traditional Roman Catholic way. What the Church has taught me is right and wrong. For centuries and centuries, that I believe and that I try to practice. He is not doing that. So I think objectively, it's not a matter of calling in a board of enlightened theologians to decide this. It's a matter of simply recognizing the facts, the existence of this table, the existence of this statue. It's hard, cold fact. I hope that now that Archbishop Lefebvre is no longer trying to appease or satisfy those whom he called antichrists less than a year ago. In other words, he's not going to the Vatican anymore and trying to deal with those who have brought about this revolution and are confirming the revolution. I hope now that he will weed out or cut out, like so many tumors, from his society the changes that he's put in there. I hope that he will return to the purity of the Catholic liturgy, take out the changes of John the 23rd, take out the later changes that came in the 1950s, and just go back to the liturgy as it was before the late changes took place and become fully traditional.
Father, one thing I would like not to ask you, but I'd like to ask you to comment about this. I'd like to ask the hierarchy of the post-Vatican II Church. If they follow John Paul II, and John Paul II says everyone is saved by merit of the virtue of the Incarnation for all time, everyone's going to heaven, why should anyone get excited about the excommunication? They say,
since we're all going to heaven anyway.
That's right.
What does excommunication mean anyway?
Why is everyone concerned about this?
It doesn't make sense. It's true.
Father,
why is anyone concerned about it?
I had a guest on the show who's been in the news recently, Father Clarence Kelly, and I posed to him the question I posed to you about this: does everyone have to become a theologian? Surely God does not expect all of us to have a high level of theological knowledge to make fine distinctions. His response was, you don't have to be a doctorate in theology to understand this. He said these changes were so manifestly wrong that just basic catechetical Catholic common sense could tell they're wrong. How do you view this attitude?
I think it's true. People know, or should know, that you cannot change the words of Christ in the Gospels. But when they write the new Mass and put it into English, they say, they put the words of Christ they change the words of Christ. They quote our Lord as saying during the moment of consecration, this blood is shed for you and for all men. Then they even chop the men off because it's offensive to the women's livers, and they say, Christ this blood is shed for you and for all. They're simply monkeying around with the words of Christ in order to promote their new doctrine of universal salvation and ecumenism. Anyone should recognize that that is not right. You cannot change the words of Christ. Any school child would know that.
Father, what, in closing then, is what should the Catholic, today's Catholic, do in this situation?
Well, I think the Catholic today should simply return to the traditional Catholic religion. Not the accommodation, which has substantially the old Mass, but with the introduction of various revolutionary elements, as Archbishop Lefebvre has tried to juggle the old and the new. But to go back to the old way before the changes took place. If the Catholic recognizes the changes are bad, then he cannot pick and choose what of the changes he likes and reject those he doesn't like. He must go back to the traditional Catholic Mass. That is what we have done at St. Teresa's. I was at a barber shop recently, and as I walked out the door, the barber said to me, "Don't get yourself excommunicated now." And I said, "Well, I don't intend to change my religion either. And if that's the price of being a Catholic, then that's fine."
Our guest has been Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa's of the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio. As Our Lady said at La Salette, France, Rome will become the seat of Antichrist in the latter times. On behalf of Catholic